I never thought that cleaning my son's room could turn into a moment of vulnerability I would never forget. One ordinary afternoon, a simple chore took a sudden emotional twist that left us both seeing each other differently. What happened next changed the way I think about family, love, and understanding. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. I had been avoiding it for weeks. The room had slowly become its own little ecosystem of clothes, books, and random objects that seemed to multiply overnight. You know, the kind of mess that makes you walk in and feel like the floor is a stranger you don't want to touch. My son, Joshua, had been living in this room for 20 years now, and I had accepted, at least in theory, that a little chaos was normal. But today, for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I felt a surge of determination. I was going in. The air in the hallway was still warm from the morning sun, a lazy golden glow that highlighted dust motes drifting slowly in the light. I stood at the doorway, hands on my hips, and took a deep breath. "All right, Melissa," I muttered to myself, "today is the day." I started with the books. They were stacked precariously on the corner of his desk, some open, some hidden beneath layers of papers. I straightened a few, feeling a small thrill of order spreading through the chaos. I didn't realize how tense I had been carrying that little nagging worry in my chest until I felt it slowly loosen with every neat stack I made. Then came the clothes. Oh, the clothes! They were everywhere, piled on chairs, slung over the back of the door, spilling out of the laundry basket like a colorful avalanche. As I sifted through them, I caught a glimpse of a worn t-shirt that had clearly been a favorite. I held it up, inhaling the faint scent of him, sunlight, soap, a hint of the cologne he sometimes borrowed from me. A pang of nostalgia hit me, sharp and warm at the same time. I had always been close to Joshua, but sometimes I realized how quickly time had passed, how he had grown into his own man without me noticing every step. I was kneeling by the bed when I heard the softest click of the door handle. My heart jumped. Joshua wasn't supposed to be home for another hour. I froze, unsure if I should pretend nothing was happening or try to greet him casually. Before I could decide, he stepped in. "Mom?" His voice was cautious, almost wary. He leaned against the doorframe, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "What are you doing in my room?" I smiled, though it was a little sheepish. "Cleaning," I said simply. "Figured it was about time." He walked further in, taking in the transformation with a slow nod. "Looks organized," he said, a teasing smile tugging at his lips. "Did you come in here hoping to find a buried treasure?" I laughed, feeling some of the tension drain out of me. "Maybe," I admitted. Or maybe I just wanted to touch some sense of order in my life. Joshua moved toward his dresser, picking up a pair of socks and tossing them neatly into the drawer. "You know," he said, "I actually kind of like having you here. It's comforting." I blinked, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. Comforting. The word made me realize how much I had missed these small moments. The ones where it wasn't about arguments or schedules or responsibilities. It was about simply being present, quietly with someone you love. As I worked, Joshua sat on the edge of the bed, watching me with a softness I hadn't seen in years. There was a subtle tension, yes, but it wasn't the kind that comes from anger or fear. It was the kind that arises from care, from unspoken emotions trying to find a way to express themselves. I felt it too, a strange warmth in my chest, a recognition of our shared history and the unspoken understanding that, no matter what, we had always been a team. At one point, I picked up an old photograph that had slipped behind the nightstand. It was of Joshua as a little boy, wearing a crooked baseball cap and grinning from ear to ear. I held it to my chest, suddenly overcome by a wave of tenderness. He noticed and leaned over, resting a hand lightly on my shoulder. "I remember that day," he said softly. "You were so proud." I nodded, trying to hide the lump in my throat. "I still am," I whispered. For a long while, we simply moved around the room together, arranging, folding, and sometimes just pausing to look at something from the past. There was a quiet intimacy in that shared effort, a gentle rhythm that felt unexpectedly soothing. The room, once chaotic and oppressive, seemed to breathe with us, as if it recognized the care being poured into it. By the time we finished, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. The room looked entirely different, not just cleaner, but lighter, more alive. Joshua stood in the center, hands in his pockets, looking at me with that same soft expression. "Thanks, Mom," he said simply, "for caring enough to do this. It means a lot." I smiled, feeling a tear threaten to fall, quickly brushing it away. "You're welcome, Joshua," I said. "I guess I needed it too." And in that quiet moment, I realized that cleaning his room hadn't just been about tidying up. It had been about reconnecting, about seeing each other fully, without distraction, without pretense. It was about understanding that even in ordinary moments, we can discover something profound. The warmth of the afternoon sun, the scent of clean laundry, and the gentle presence of my son made me feel unexpectedly full, as if a small, hidden part of my heart had been waiting for this very day to be acknowledged. I closed the closet doors slowly, listening to Joshua shuffle to the window, watching the neighborhood bathed in soft light. We didn't speak much after that, but the silence was comfortable, heavy with meaning. And for the first time in a long while, I felt an unspoken promise linger in the air, that sometimes the simplest actions, folding clothes, straightening books, sharing quiet space, could be the moments that mattered most. After that afternoon, something in the house felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but every time I passed Joshua's room, I felt a little thrill of quiet anticipation. Not the kind you feel before something dramatic or risky, more like the gentle tug of curiosity mixed with affection. That evening after dinner, I found myself lingering in the kitchen, absent-mindedly wiping down the counters, while listening to the faint hum of Joshua moving around upstairs. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but there was a sort of comfort in hearing him settle into his space, the soft creak of the floorboards, the occasional rustle of clothes or papers being rearranged. It reminded me of when he was little, and I would sit in the kitchen late at night, listening to him sleep through the walls. I had just poured myself a cup of tea when there was a soft knock at the back door. "Mom?" Joshua's voice called. I walked over and opened it, surprised to see him holding a small box. "I thought you might like these," he said, stepping inside. Inside the box were some of his old notebooks, sketches, and a few letters he had written when he was in college. I smiled, feeling a wave of nostalgia wash over me. "Oh, Joshua, these are amazing." "Thank you," I said, my voice soft. He shrugged a little awkwardly. "I didn't know what else to do with them, but I wanted you to see them. They're important, I guess." I took the box from him, setting it gently on the counter. "Important to you?" I asked. He nodded, leaning back against the doorway, looking slightly vulnerable. "Yeah, and maybe to you too," he admitted, his eyes meeting mine for a moment longer than usual. I realized then how much I had underestimated the layers of his life that were quietly waiting to be shared with me. He was no longer the little boy who had reluctantly cleaned his room or tried to hide his feelings. He was a man who had lived, experienced, and grown, and he wanted me to know him fully. We spent the next hour together, going through the contents of the box. I held each notebook in my hands, flipping through pages filled with sketches of people, places, and moments from his life. Some were funny, some thoughtful, some heartbreakingly raw. I could feel his personality radiating from the paper, the boy I had raised, and the man he had become coexisting in every stroke of the pen. At one point, he pulled a page out and showed me a sketch of the two of us sitting in the park when he was about 10. We were laughing, and I could almost hear the echoes of that day in the lines of the drawing. "I remember this," I said quietly, touching the paper. "You made me look happy." "You always were happy, Mom," he said, smiling. "Even when I was driving you crazy." I laughed, and for a moment, the world outside our kitchen seemed to fade. The conversation took on a rhythm, a flow that was unhurried and natural, full of pauses and glances that carried more meaning than words ever could. As the evening grew darker, Joshua stayed longer than I had expected. We moved to the living room, talking quietly about dreams, regrets, and moments that had shaped us. I noticed the way he looked at me, attentive, patient, and present. There was no judgment, no need to perform or explain, just a simple, genuine interest in connecting. At one point, he reached out and touched my hand lightly. It was fleeting, almost accidental, but it sent a small shiver down my spine. I didn't pull away. Instead, I allowed the warmth of his presence to settle around me, feeling a depth of affection I hadn't realized I was missing. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't anything inappropriate, but it was intensely intimate in a way that only comes from true trust and emotional honesty. The night deepened and Joshua finally said he should head to his room. I walked him to the doorway, and he paused, turning to face me fully. "Thanks, Mom," he said again, his voice low and steady. I like these moments with you." I smiled, feeling a lump in my throat. "Me too, Joshua. More than I can say." He nodded, a small, contented smile on his face, and disappeared into his room. I closed the door slowly, leaning against it for a moment. The house felt quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken connections, of understanding that didn't require constant affirmation but thrived in shared presence. Later, as I sat alone in the living room with my tea growing cold, I reflected on the afternoon and evening. I realized that sometimes the most profound moments don't come from grand gestures or life-changing events. They come from small, intentional acts of care, from listening and being truly present with the people you love. I felt a sense of discovery, not about Joshua, but about myself. I had been so busy, so wrapped up in routines of obligations, that I had forgotten how to slow down and experience connection. That evening had reminded me of the beauty in patience, in understanding, and in valuing the emotional currents that flow quietly beneath the surface of everyday life. By the time I finally went to bed, the house was still and calm. I could hear the faint rustle of Joshua's room as he moved around, settling into sleep. A soft smile formed on my lips. I realized that moments like these, unexpected, tender, and deeply human, were the ones I would carry with me for a long time. And I also realized with a quiet thrill that this was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of quiet anticipation I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't excitement in the frantic, jittery way, but a slow, warm curiosity that spread through me like sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor. The house was still, the kind of still that makes you notice the faint ticking of the clock and the subtle hum of the refrigerator. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, thinking about the previous day and how unexpectedly full it had been, not just with activity, but with meaning. Joshua was still asleep upstairs, so I had a few moments of peaceful solitude. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the warmth of the coffee in my hands, and I found myself smiling at the memory of our shared laughter and quiet confessions. It struck me how easy it had felt to simply be with him, without agendas or expectations. That simplicity was rare, and I was suddenly aware of how much I had missed it. Around mid-morning, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Joshua appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, wearing a loose t-shirt and casual sweatpants. His hair was slightly mussed, and his expression carried the sleepy yet alert look I had always adored. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice soft but carrying that familiar warmth. "Morning, Joshua," I replied, smiling. "Sleep well?" He nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Better than I thought I would." He glanced around the kitchen, noticing the small notes of care I had left out: fresh fruit in a bowl, a neatly folded kitchen towel, a steaming cup of tea waiting for me. "You really do think of everything," he said with a teasing grin. "I try," I said, feeling the corners of my mouth lift. "Even little things matter." Joshua sipped his coffee, and we fell into a comfortable silence, the kind where words aren't necessary to feel connected. I watched him, really watched him, noticing the subtle shifts in his expression, the faint lines around his eyes that had deepened with age, and the way his hands moved as he cradled the mug. I realized that I had been so focused on the big moments of life that I often missed these quiet, ordinary instances, the ones that actually carried the most meaning. After a while, Joshua set down his cup and leaned against the counter. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about yesterday, about all of it." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "All of what?" "About us, Mom. About how we connected. I guess I've been meaning to say that I appreciate it more than I can really put into words." There was a pause, a vulnerability in his tone that made my chest tighten. "I feel like we don't have enough of these moments, and I want more." His words caught me off guard, not because I didn't feel the same, but because he expressed it so openly, without hesitation. There was a delicate tension in the air, a mix of comfort and intensity, and I realized that this was a turning point for us. It wasn't about drama or conflict. It was about acknowledging something real, something quietly profound that had been waiting to surface. I reached out and touched his arm lightly. "Joshua, I feel the same. Yesterday, it reminded me how much I treasure these moments with you. More than I realized." He looked at me, his eyes softening, and for a moment, the world outside the kitchen seemed to disappear. There was a closeness between us that wasn't physical in the romantic sense, but it carried a depth of trust and intimacy that I had rarely experienced with anyone, even in my adult relationships. It was emotional resonance, pure and unguarded. We spent the rest of the morning talking about our lives, small details, big decisions, regrets, and little victories. Joshua shared memories of his early college years, the friendships he had cherished, the mistakes he had learned from. I told him stories from my own past, the ones I rarely shared, the moments that shaped who I was. With every story, every shared laugh or thoughtful silence, I felt our bond strengthen, a mutual respect and understanding growing between us like sunlight through the clouds. Around lunchtime, Joshua paused and looked at me with a reflective expression. "Mom, can I ask you something a little unusual?" "Of course," I said, curious. He hesitated for a moment before continuing. Would you want to do this more often? Just us, spending time together like this. Not chores, not routines, not anything else, just us." I felt a warmth bloom in my chest, a sense of relief and happiness mingled with something deeper, a recognition of the emotional hunger we had both carried without naming it. "I'd like that, Joshua," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I'd like that very much." He smiled, that easy, genuine smile that had always been one of my favorite things about him. "Good," he said, "because I think we could both use it, and maybe even grow from it." I nodded, feeling a quiet, profound joy. It wasn't dramatic or overly sentimental. It was the kind of happiness that comes from being fully seen, fully understood, and fully accepted by someone you love. It was a rare gift, and I felt incredibly grateful for it. As the day moved on, I noticed subtle changes in the way we interacted. We were lighter, more attuned to each other's moods, more willing to share small gestures, a touch on the arm, a smile across the room, a knowing glance that spoke volumes. There was a tension, yes, but it was not uncomfortable. It was charged with care, respect, and the kind of emotional intimacy that deepens bonds. By evening, the house felt alive in a new way. The sunlight filtered through the windows, casting warm patterns across the floor, and the faint scent of Joshua's cologne mixed with the lingering aroma of my tea. I realized that yesterday's cleaning of his room had been just the beginning. It had opened a door to something far more meaningful, a space where we could be entirely ourselves and yet entirely connected. Before heading to bed, I lingered in the hallway outside his room, listening to the gentle sounds of life within. I felt a sense of hope and anticipation for the days ahead. not because I expected extraordinary events, but because I now understood that emotional closeness, mutual respect, and shared vulnerability could transform ordinary days into something extraordinary. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I knew that whatever came next, Joshua and I had crossed a threshold. Our bond had deepened, and it carried the potential to teach us both about love, understanding, and the beauty of truly seeing one another.